I would say that 95% of the inquiries we get, the client, the MarTech leader is telling us, hey, Tony, Jarrod, I feel like we're behind on all this. I've seen all these sexy case studies, and first of all, just statistically, 95% of you can't be behind. There's the hype and there's the reality.
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech. Ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission. Advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
Welcome back to the Real Story on MarTech. I'm Jarrod Gingras, Managing Director of the Real Story Group.
And I'm Tony Byrne, founder of Real Story Group.
All right, Tony, today's topic is real lessons from real MarTech leaders. And the reason we picked this topic today, because if all you did was look at vendor case studies, you'd think that enterprise MarTech leaders are accomplishing these dazzling feats and way out in front of the pack when it comes to leveraging things like AI and agents and advanced content supply chains, data-driven marketing, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, totally. But what's interesting is after working with these leaders, you and I know that their day-to-day reality is much more prosaic. I mean, many enterprise MarTech decision makers are trying to solve some pretty basic stuff, albeit in some very much shifting environments.
Yeah, it's very prosaic and basic at times, but it doesn't mean that they're not being creative and innovative, though.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it turns out that if you lead a MarTech team and you direct a complex stack at a large enterprise, you have a lot of lessons to share. So that's what we're going to do today, lessons from enterprise MarTech leaders. So, Jarrod, let's start with some background. I mean, when we're talking about so-called MarTech leaders, just who are these people?
Yeah, I think we need to rewind time a little bit back to about 6 years ago, because we were getting all these inquiries about how do I execute on an omnichannel future and what are the implications of this on my stack. And you and I were having these conversations on a daily basis with our clients. And I think ultimately we both came to the realization that wouldn't it be great if we get these MarTech leaders in a room and these people that are asking these really difficult questions in the same room. So we founded this MarTech Stack Leadership Council, like I said, 6 years ago. And since then, we've had about 20 in-person or virtual meetings on a whole slew of different topics. So basically what we set out to create and what it's evolved into is a vendor-free environment where we can all kind of share notes on the stack implications due to some pretty big major trends. We've covered things like Omnichannel, like I mentioned, but personalization and now AI and how this affects my stack. And it's really an amazing group from leaders from a whole slew of different industries. No one industry dominates these meetings. It's really a cross-section of every industry across the globe.
Yeah, and one interesting thing is that while all these folks self-describe as MarTech leaders, they do come from different parts of the enterprise, including IT, data, marketing ops, or frequently, a specifically designated MarTech operation.
Yeah, but if there's one thread that kind of ties them all together, I'd say that they all tend to work at really large, really complicated enterprises, typically like the Fortune 100 or Global 2000 type companies.
Yeah, and at that scale, their problems are just different, aren't they?
Yes, they certainly are all facing some really complex challenges. And when you try to apply or try to solve really complex challenges at scale, it really forces you to have to get the basics right? So, we found that that's been a lot of struggle for some of these organizations and they've realized that we have to get the basics right to get to where we want to go. So what we were kind of concerned, would these leaders be willing to share their best practices and lessons around how they were able to get over these hurdles? And the fact of the matter is that they are. It's been a very forthcoming group, and everyone wants to share their lessons with their peers, and it's been really, really fun to see.
Right. So now we're going to share some of those lessons with the wider world, right?
Well, we are and we're not. I just want to be completely honest here. This group is very confidential, right? All of the members of the group agree not to attribute anything they hear to any company or individual, and we're certainly not going to do that here. But we're going to highlight some really key themes that we've heard over the years.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. But with that in mind, let's just get into it. There's really a ton to say here, but just to keep us on point, let's break down these experiences and lessons into 5 key categories. So number one, customer data, always a topic and arguably foundational for all of this. Personalization, always a hot topic. Content supply chains, really important in the era of AI. Fourth topic would be stack modernization and, of course, more AI. And then finally, the fifth and maybe trickiest one that will draw some lessons is around MarTech organizational structures.
Sounds good. 5 categories, 5 areas where there's a ton of lessons to talk about, right? So we're going to break it down as best we can, but let's dive right into it right now and talk about customer data.
Yeah, everything kind of starts here, but it doesn't really end here.
How would you sum up what large enterprise customers are thinking as it relates to customer data? I know it's a big topic, but like let's kind of jump off there.
Yeah, so the biggest one really that I need to talk about, and we've kind of foreshadowed this a bit in some previous episodes, is that the really big current, particularly for larger enterprises over the past 5-6 years, it's an architectural question. So at Real Story Group, we distinguish between a customer data hub, which is a 360 view of all your customer data, raw, processed, so forth, often but not always living in a lakehouse, and then a customer data orchestration that's managed by your marketing team that allows you to leverage and activate that data. And we made this distinction pretty early on in this decade, really after observing council members. And these council members, particularly from large firms, they already had substantial customer data infrastructure in place. Now, that infrastructure might have been messy, but it was there. And so what was interesting is, the CDP vendors at that time tried to do all things. They tried to do this data ops stuff around identity resolution and data processing, as well as marketing ops stuff. And our council members looked at that and said, no way, nope. We want these things to be separated, into separate domains, data ops versus sort of marketing ops. And the good news is, that the CDP market has responded.
So it sounds like they're making a case for what we hear often as a composable CDP.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if what our council members would say there, if composable means separating those two concerns, the data operations in terms of customer data processing as opposed to data orchestration, which is a marketing ops function, then they would say, yes, we want that level of composability. If your notion of composable CDP means consigning the marketing team to using these techie reverse ETL vendors like High Touch and Census, then I would say no, that's not a place they want to go. None of our stack members have gone that way.
Well, that's interesting because, I think back and we've actually helped several council members actually pick a replacement CDP because the first one was maybe not such a good fit.
Yeah, I mean, some of that was just, the CDP market was young, still is youngish, and so people made quick and bad choices. But some of it was just this poor architectural alignment that we talked about earlier. So that's a good news story because the market now is so broad that among our council members, we see a lot of different choices for them.
Yeah. And it certainly shines a light on the quality of your data. We hear often that, your customer data house is just not ready and not really in order. Obviously there's the old garbage in, garbage out, but also that I think we see customers telling us that they can't find key attributes or even attach certain attributes to an individual's record, and that's a huge stumbling block.
Yeah, for sure. I think one key lesson from the last 6 years is that among our council members, the ones who are really successful at this have a never-ending program of gathering and refining customer data. That job is never, ever done.
Yeah, and then the final lesson that we've heard over and over again from members when it comes to data is the importance of involving legal, privacy, and compliance early in the process, because we want to avoid as many surprises as possible. We don't want the surprises to come at the end of the process. We want to involve it early. And, they have the power to really put a spanner in the works, and we've seen them use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, everyone now, particularly with this whole, dance around so-called cookie lists and everything, everyone talks about first-party data or 1P data. And, you have to treat it as oil. It's your corporate crown jewels. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. But if they are your crown jewels, then ultimately you really want to make friends with your compliance and privacy team because the good news is they're going to keep you from doing things that you really shouldn't be doing.
And of course, this brings up the question, what do we want to do with all this data? Even if we get it perfectly right, what do we want to do? And the first thing that always comes off the lips of leaders from our clients is personalization. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, it's really been an evergreen topic over the past 6 years on our MarTech Leadership Council.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to that point, Tony. At the end of each meeting, we survey the council on what topics they want to cover next, and we almost always put personalization on our list of choices, and personalization always finds its way to bubble to the top.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really funny that even after we did a meeting, we held at least one meeting that was entirely on personalization, and at the end of that meeting, they've said, "Yeah, we want more." So obviously, it's a super hot topic.
It's so funny. Everyone assumes that everyone has really cracked the code on this. Everyone thinks that they're behind. In the reality, no one has. At least not at the scale and across channels that are the leaders desire. Or have ambition to achieve. No one's cracked this.
Yeah. And when you listen carefully to MarTech leaders who have spent a lot of time on this, they do identify a lot of challenges. I mean, historically, there's been obviously some technical challenges. Do you have the available tooling in the channel where you want it? What about performance? Personalization can really affect performance. How is this going to affect compliance and regulatory issues, privacy? And is your data house in order? Because you need actionable, unified data. Now, companies have made a lot of progress on those technical challenges, but then any number of different business challenges come up, like do I have a segmentation and targeting strategy? Do I have an executable that is a sustainable content model? We'll talk about that in a minute. Personalization really throws off your whole metrics and analytics and reporting frameworks, and so you need to advance there. Is your decisioning sustainable? In other words, if I create a set of rules, can I actually adapt those over time? And then finally, just all these issues around omnichannel orchestration, which are also evergreen. So, there's a lot of challenges here that sometimes people, don't always talk about. They don't always come up, but it's been really great kind of exploring these and working through them in these meetings. And the other thing that we learned is the dirty little secret is that most personalization pilots seem to fail, often because there's really poor ROI.
Yeah, all true. But I think we've also seen council members sharing some more directional type lessons as well. For example, they tell us that it's typically more effective, especially cost effective, to personalize application screens or particularly e-commerce screens rather than trying to personalize straight up static content, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been a lot of attention, I think we see paid to recommendations in particular, but you have to be pretty sophisticated to be able to pull that off at least well, right? Maybe you can check the box, but to do it well, it's really, you have to be sophisticated. So not everyone can be Amazon here, and it takes a lot of experience to pull the right levers at the right time and to put the right things in front of the right people that they really want or even need.
Yeah, and what's interesting when you dig into the case studies that have shown success, it's usually they're leveraging kind of like the right blend of behavioral and profile data, and this is really important because some platforms rely very heavily or exclusively on behavioral data like Clickstream, and others more heavily on profile data, and really you want to be able to ground your personalization strategy in some mix of both. And so that's technically and procedurally difficult. But, one of my favorite anecdotes was a council member that sent out SMS messages to opted-in customers, but they did that when their favorite soccer team scored. I really loved that. But, it sounds like that would be relatively straightforward. Behind the scenes, a little trickier.
Yeah, as someone who's dabbled in sports gambling, I'd like that anecdote as well. But, what that sounds to me is like we're talking about like one-to-one personalization. But I think what we found is really on the back end, all that is driven with segments. It's not true one-to-one necessarily. And one takeaway from council members is to start with larger segments and then progressively make them smaller as you learn. Do some rounds of testing and keep learning and get smaller and smaller. And obviously, AI is going to play a big role in how we execute this going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about AI in a minute, but the leaders whose firms are really executing well here, they've built these evergreen, always-on personalization programs. So it's not a project, it's a program with a lot of methodical test and learn. And, we've been witnessing this really over the past 2 decades so much that honestly, I think I'm coming to the conclusion that the biggest indicator of success with personalization might just be sheer persistence.
Okay, I agree with that as the biggest indicator of success, but I'm going to bring up the biggest indicator of potential failure. And I'm just going to say it's on the content side. It's really hard to consistently create, manage, and deploy all the content, and especially all these experience variants you need for personalization. It's the dirty little secret here. You got to feed the beast with content, and it's hard to do.
Yep, and that brings us to our third topic, which, as you say, you can't really have rich experiences without high-value content. And for MarTech leaders in our council, that has them thinking really hard about creative and content supply chains. So tell us a little bit, Jarrod, what do they have to say about that?
Well, they have a lot to say about creative and content supply chain, certainly. And I think most of what they're saying is around some frustration they're having with having to muscle through their increasingly more complicated requirements as it relates to content with legacy and often still manual processes. And I'd say the entire concept of this content supply chain or a creative content supply chain, when we had our first meeting 6 years ago, this was a completely novel concept to many of the people in the room, but now it's the norm.
Yeah, I mean, for a while, it seemed like the term content marketing was predominant, and you even saw these so-called content marketing platform vendors, but that always just felt kind of tactical in nature and not really strategic or procedural.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. When you think about or start talking about the content supply chain at large, you're talking about the entire creative supply chain, and you're including a whole network of players and processes, including external agencies, and you're talking about a process. And one of the more interesting things that council members have done is to carefully map that process and then try to align it with other processes, hopefully they're related processes like product development or application updates. And it was pretty eye-opening to see when you start putting that down on paper.
Yeah, and so at that point, you can start to identify efficiencies, which are clearly needed if you want to scale for personalization. But what was interesting is that the most advanced MarTech leaders found that a more effective business case to improving the content supply chain could be made around speed. That is, you're improving your time to market for things like campaigns. And that's where the big wins really came when we're talking about enhancing the content supply chain. But Jarrod, another topic here before we step away from this is, you mentioned external agencies. It seems like there's kind of a cyclical nature to engagement here. We're leaning hard on our agencies. We're bringing more in-house. What do council members, what have they had to say, especially lately about working with agencies?
Yeah, I mean, you and I have been doing this a long time, 20 plus years. And I think over the years, we've definitely seen that pendulum swing back and forth, to going really relying heavily on external agencies to bringing some in-house and even going as far as building full capabilities of in-house agencies. And I can tell you, recently, we've seen a massive swing back in-house, and I'm not saying it won't change again because it probably will, but at least I think AI is really pushing people to think about creative and who owns my assets in a much different way. And so we're seeing some momentum certainly internally at this point.
Yeah, the who owns my assets is so critical because we talked about data as being oil, certainly particularly in the era of AI, your assets and owning your assets and leveraging your content assets is also kind of fuel. But that kind of, seems to imply this notion of enterprise-worthy components. Those could be singular or compound assets or text or images or data or some combination. Things that the enterprise really want to manage carefully because they're critical to their omnichannel strategies. And so at RSG, we've talked a lot about truly omnichannel content engagement and the notion of omnichannel content platforms. We're going to be talking about that, I know, in our next episode. But seems kind of future gazing. Are council members actually doing this?
Like you said, we're going to be talking about this in the future, and we've alluded to it in past episodes. But this is a very real thing that we're talking about. This journey that every enterprise is on, from thinking about managing content in a silo, as just to get their hands around their content in some way, to starting to connect content repositories to other systems, to this new notion that has become very real and really investing in this idea of not just managing images and video in a repository, but starting to think, what makes my content truly omnichannel, and can I manage that content in a way that allows me to create different experiences at every single touch point? So we use this 4-point scale oftentimes, and the 3.0 type scale or phase in that scale is omnichannel content platforms with an eye on a 4.0 scale, which is predictive platforms, which we'll get to in much detail. But the key here is that you can't get to 4.0 without getting to 3.0. So it's this notion of managing content at the right granular level, managing content relationships in a way that allow you to do a lot of things that you can't even dream of doing today because you don't have those relationships in place, and making sure that you start to marry up some data with your content so that your content is smart enough to take the actions on it that you desire as well. So it's a massive way of thinking. And I go back to 6 years ago when we introduced this concept. 3.0 was a dream for so many organizations, but today we are seeing so many of the world's largest enterprises investing to get to 3.0 because they know they can't get to that predictive platform of the future without getting their omni-channel content in order in a way that is truly going to allow them to take advantage of that wealth of content that they have.
Yeah. But, I'm struck, what we're really talking about here is about component content and component content variants for personalization, for predictive use, for faster, leaner content supply chains. And of course, whenever you say that, the topic of AI comes up. AI in general, and of course, generative AI specifically. So what lessons have council members been sharing with us here?
Yeah, so it's a little dangerous to be talking about AI because things are happening so fast and changing so fast, right? But I think two broad lessons from the case studies that we heard most recently amongst our council is, number one, AI might prove more useful today in terms of content analytics than content generation, right? So that might seem counterintuitive, but AI, at least today, is doing a better job of telling you what's working as opposed to creating a bunch of new, highly optimized assets. And so there's a slight distinction there, but at least where we stand today, I think it's better at content analytics than content generation. And then the second lesson, there's clearly a tactical role for generative AI in content marketing. Everyone's bought into that. But the fact of the matter is the platforms are not ready to scale for this idea of this always on, pervasively personalized content and experiences. In other words, we're not ready to transform the content supply chain just yet. It might happen as soon as even next year or later this year. I doubt later this year might be pushing it, but it's going to happen at some point, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, and clearly there's a lot more to say here, but it's confidential to council members, so we'll have to step there. But this whole discussion is a great lead-in to our fourth set of lessons learned, which is really around MarTech stack evolution and this huge topic of AI more generally.
Yeah, we have a lot to say here. I know that.
Yeah, so let's start with stack modernization. And it was interesting because, if you remember during and coming out of the pandemic, MarTech leaders were very much trying to attach themselves to these huge so-called digital transformation initiatives that were already brewing before the pandemic, definitely got accelerated. And of course, you could see why. There's this huge pot of money, and surely MarTech transformation is part of broader enterprise digital transformation. But for many of them, it became kind of like a scrum. I think one council member said that he called it like a Hunger Games style competition for this big ball of capital funding. And it turns out really in retrospect that that's not a great way to transform your stack.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of transformation. Don't get me wrong, but it's not something you just throw new technology at and expect to achieve what you're trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. And so as we've watched this play out over the past 6 to 10 years, the firms that have really worked instead on an ongoing stack modernization program with clear goals and milestones, they seem to end up, frankly, just accomplishing more.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm going to call back to what we've talked about on some previous episodes of this podcast. It's these firms that you're talking about are the ones that avoided that vendor bullying from the big behemoths in the marketplace who are trying to sell you a stack in a box, like the Adobes and the Salesforces of the world. It's also tends to be characteristic of these firms that they're more advanced in building this legless market architecture that we've talked about in the past as well.
Yeah, so just to sum it up, legless is where you invest in core channel and agnostic systems around data, content, and decisioning, and then you get lighter at the glass with simpler platforms for things like outbound campaigns, web CMS, and so forth. It's much easier to do this in the context of a multi-year modernization roadmap than a 2-year digital transformation, capital-intensive lunge, right?
Yep. All right, Tony, let's talk about AI. We've avoided it. We've hinted at it a little bit, but let's dive right in. It's AI today is, there's so much going on. Like we said, it's changing so fast. It's really hard to get your head around. So we as analysts, we like to put things in boxes. So I think hopefully this is helpful for people as they listen today. We like to put AI into 4 distinct boxes or 4 distinct kinds of AI. So number 1, we have agentic AI or agentic in general, which is autonomous agents performing work. We have insights AI, which is all about gleaning new intelligence from your data. We have decisioning AI, which is driving things that we identified early as really, really important, like next best action or next best experience. And then finally, everyone's favorite, generative AI, which is all about creating new or updated ideas, content, experiences, all based on a repository and learning and creating something new. So agentic, insights, decisioning, generative. Tony, what lessons are you seeing here from enterprise MarTech leaders?
Oh boy. All right. Well, let's start with that categorization and talk about what's real and what's not real in each one of those categories. So let's start right away with agent AI. Really, no one is anywhere yet. The key word there is, of course, is yet. It's June 18th, 2025. Vendors are lighting these up in their platforms. From what we can tell, major enterprises are reluctant to deploy them now, and for some very good reasons. First of all, it assumes a kind of maturity in your core AI processes and controls that often just isn't there yet.
Yeah, and it's surprising because I dare you to go to a conference today and start counting how many times you hear the word agentic and how it makes you see them again like everyone's behind. But anyways, let's talk about the most useful agents of the future. They're not just something that are going to be in a single platform. They're going to have to be cross-platform, and that's just hard to build and hard to deploy, hard to manage.
That's right. Yeah. And so a lot of the agents that we see now are things that vendors can put in their own platforms, which might help you with some workflow, but otherwise are not necessarily going to be super impactful, we believe. And certainly our council members kind of bear that out. But when we turn, there's a different story, though, when we turn to insights and decisioning AI. And what's super interesting about those two categories is these are the areas where our council members are telling us that they're the most mature and have rolled out the more pilots into production. Since these are kind of behind the scenes, you don't always see it as much, but there's a lot of really interesting experimentation that's leading to a number of interesting, actual production systems around insights AI and decisioning.
And that was kind of surprising to us. I think, speaking for the Real Story Group team, you hear so much about generative AI, right? That's the flashy, demos well, stuff that demos well. Every vendor's talking about their generative AI capabilities. We thought maybe that would be where some people would be more advanced, but it just wasn't the case. I think it might be flashy, like we said, but it's less mature, and there's serious issues around the ROI around generative AI, especially when you're operationalizing at scale. There's still a lot of good promise here, but I think it's only really beneficial when you start to think of the true breadth of the potential use cases.
Yeah, I mean, the breadth of use cases for generative AI is what's so exciting, even if they're not all being necessarily put into production yet. There's still a lot of aspirations there, and some of those aspirations are surely going to pan out. But I want to go back to this notion that we mentioned earlier, maturity. So at our last in-person council meeting, it was in Atlanta, we got pretty deep on this topic of AI maturity, and we did some actual measurements with the folks who were there. And what was interesting about that is that it turned out that even the largest, more sophisticated enterprises measured fairly low on an AI capability spectrum. Now, this doesn't mean that they're disinterested, and it doesn't mean the potential's not there, but it does mean that they are struggling to operationalize this stuff. And frankly, the vendor and analyst hype is out of control and way out of sync with what enterprises are really doing here.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, there's one really interesting data point came up that among the various dimensions that we polled them on, the council members said that they were most advanced in terms of AI governance maturity, which I got to say, that's good news, right? That bodes well for future development. But, like we mentioned, still ROI and other challenges are still an issue. But the fact that we're thinking about governance, that's a really good thing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the other interesting thing that came out of this is that the companies who were really advanced, who had these frameworks in place, actually were able to see greater business benefit down the road. So in other words, these kind of compliance and controls were not restricting, they were actually liberating. It was kind of this freedom that comes once you have a framework there. But if we talk about governance, then that really brings us back to our fifth and maybe one of our favorite council topics. It's certainly an item of persistent conversation, and that is MarTech organizational models.
Yeah, that's certainly one that's evergreen and really hard. And it's funny, us as technology analysts, we expected the conversations to be much more on technology almost all the time, but invariably we get back to these discussions around what's the organizational model I need to support this omnichannel stack of the future, right? And, the first thing to point out is among the council members, we found a pretty solid consensus that with respect to budgeting, an enterprise should spend about 90% on human resources and only 10% on technology. So it's not clear that everyone's holding to that ratio, exactly, but it shows you how important the people side is in an era of AI and technology transformation.
So, how you organize these people then becomes a critically important topic. And what's been fascinating for me to witness is the exceptionally wide differences in how enterprises organize the MarTech function. Wide differences in what they label as roles and teams and overall reporting structures. It's all over the map. I think mostly for historical reasons, it just sort of evolved this way. At the same time, I think we can find some commonality, right?
Yeah, I think one big common theme that we've seen is that the more sophisticated enterprises has adopted more of a product management approach, in order to supplement program and platform management with the product management function squarely within the business team, right? So that's the group that owns the roadmaps, runs the communities of practice, the centers of excellence, and generally makes sure that the firm is getting the most possible value from their technology investments.
Yeah, that's a critical role. The other common theme is the pervasiveness of kind of tactical tiger teams that cross departmental boundaries. Really smart companies are all doing that. And it's interesting because sometimes you see these cross-disciplinary leadership teams like, ELTs, like enterprise leadership teams, or IABs, investment advisory boards, et cetera, et cetera. But the model works even better when you apply it for specific projects actually at the coalface among people who actually get stuff done. And you find that when you can have these integrated tiger teams, you move faster rather than constantly lobbying the ball from department to department in a very linear kind of ping pong, and I would say very inefficient way.
Yeah, that reminds me of another finding from the council. We've been talking a lot here in our meetings about in our reference models in general about the concept of omnichannel. We've said that time and time again, but one of the big inhibitors to omnichannel is governance, because you need to make the decisions about holistic customer experiences, those decisions that require alignment across multiple internal departments and stakeholders. You need to do that holistically, and you need to make sure you're thinking about ultimately the experience that you're creating at the end of the day. And so this can sometimes create a blocker, but I was intrigued about a comment that one of our council members said, and if you remember, I think she said something like, if marketing doesn't lead, no one will. So what do you think about that?
I love it. I love it when she said that. If you just stop for a moment and think about all of the other, customer facing constituents here, you've got sales, customer service and support, distribution, channel, product, all the rest. None of them have a 360 view of what's best for the customer. Now, arguably, marketing doesn't either, but they're probably the closest. So MarTech, marketing in general and MarTech specifically becomes the best leader and incubator for these customer-centric omni-channel journeys. Having said all that, it's still hard to execute on that.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about here is really how much more sophisticated a MarTech team needs to become, right? Relative to even 5 years ago, with a lot of specialized skills across a multitude of domains, not just outbound marketing, but inbound digital and paid media, and it's so much more complicated.
Yeah, marketing, data ops, analytics, everything. And there's one thing that we see this is driving, and that's greater centralization of the MarTech functionally, generally, and not just as it relates to customer and prospect journeys, but just that we mentioned earlier, but just a broader trend towards centralization.
Yeah, Tony, we mentioned the pendulum swinging in and out when it comes to agencies, but doesn't the pendulum kind of swing back and forth here in terms of centralized versus decentralized, channel versus omnichannel, global versus international, and so on? Like, these things are kind of trendy, right?
Yeah, it does swing for sure. But I'd say that since the pandemic, what council members are telling us is the pendulum from an organizational standpoint has definitely swung back towards more centralized MarTech and more centralized digital marketing ops as well. The issues here are that the platforms and the ambitions are too sophisticated for highly distributed models. But as you say, Omnichannel is also pushing this. And now, of course, in the current economic environment, we see cost-cutting pushing this. And this then requires greater standardization, and that implies a greater degree of centralization.
Yeah, or if not even just cost-cutting, there's a desire to scale data-driven marketing without increasing headcount, just doing things as is.
Yeah, I mean, everyone wants that, right? We want more campaigns, more targeted campaigns, a broader set of customer touch points that we're paying attention to in an organized way, but don't hire anybody. Right. And here's the real kicker, and of course it's AI, and AI can sometimes be tossed out there as like this do-all, fix-all to every MarTech problem. And it's really probably as we mentioned earlier, the advantages here are going to be incremental. But here we have to think about what AI wants. And what AI wants is for you to have your act together, particularly with respect to enterprise content and enterprise data. It also implies centralized controls. And we talked earlier, about freedom in a framework and being more free than if you don't have that central framework. But getting back to AI specifically and AI features, if it's done right, it requires some foundational skills and platforms that are not tied to specific channels. You have to be very suspicious of AI functions that are just lit up within a specific channel. What we're really talking about here is building your underlying AI muscle. And that's some serious muscle that you need there at your core. You've got to be doing some Pilates if you want to do AI right, and that is driving some degree of centralization as well.
Yeah, still, all that is true, but this all implies some sort of MarTech org design, right? And that's what all these leaders are thinking about. What's the right org design to achieve these goals? So I'm actually happy to say that our next council meeting is going to be all about MarTech org design. We're actually doing a session called your org structure show and tell, where we're not going to have people share names or exact roles necessarily, but we're going to talk about the different considerations that they're making in terms of centralizing, decentralizes, global versus local, and all the various other topics that we touched on today. And I think we'll even get into some basic things like, what do you even call your org just to support these efforts? There's a lot of nuances in the naming these days. And we've had a lot of clients ask us, what should I be calling these things? And I think it's going to be a real lively discussion. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, but just to clarify, that's going to be our next council meeting, not our next podcast. So it's a private council meeting. You've got to apply to join. But speaking of podcast here, why don't we just recap us here, Jarrod, on the key lessons from this one today?
Yeah. So here are the 5 themes that we've heard from our Stack Leadership Council members. Number 1, customer data. You need clean customer data house before you try to activate and leverage anything. Personalization, it's always, always, always hard. And you need to build a persistent program, not a one-time, one-off thing. Content supply chains, there's a lot of investment happening here. We are having these conversations on an almost daily basis with our clients, but truly managing omnichannel content in ways that you haven't done before is difficult and a journey. And everyone has this eye on where AI can speed up these supply chains, but you got to get your basics right, and that's where the investment is happening today. Stack modernization and AI being the 4th. And what we found here is that modernization almost always trumps transformation, and it'll best set you up for AI success, we think. And finally, org structures. There's almost as many models as there are companies, right? And the key is to be intentional and not accidental about how you set this up. So keep that in mind as you make your decisions.
Yeah, very pithy as usual, Jarrod. But I just wanted to close on this kind of one meta theme from this and really every council meeting is that, if you're a MarTech leader, you tend to think you're behind on all this new MarTech stuff, but the reality is you're probably not. I mean, I would say that 95% of the inquiries we get, the client, the MarTech leader is telling us, hey, Tony, Jarrod, I feel like we're behind on all this. I've seen all these sexy case studies, and first of all, just statistically, 95% of you can't be behind, right? So I think what we've learned from these council meetings over time is there's the hype and there's the reality, and we're all living in a world of reality, and a lot of members have found some degree of comfort that others are struggling with some of the same issues, but also some degree of direction and some practical ways to untie these knots, which has been really valuable. For our part, I would just say, this stuff is exciting, but to leverage it, you've got to lay the foundation, do the work, definitely get impartial advice, of course. I'm going to say get impartial advice because we're very partial at RSG to delivering you that advice. But most of all, you want to keep paying attention to the basics in a world that really, really, really wants to distract you.
Yeah, it's a journey, right? And no one's cracked it. No one's reached the end of the journey completely. And on that topic, I know you kind of mentioned this earlier. Our next podcast is going to be around the journey as it relates to the content that we talked about, the content supply chain, the evolution of managing content in a more omni-channel way. And we're going to get into that framework that we use quite often, that 4-phase framework where you have DAM 1.0, DAM 2.0, DAM 3.0, DAM 4.0. We'll define each of those phases and talk about what makes an organization squarely fit into each of those phases. And we think it'll be a good way for you to self-assess where you are and where you want to go. So stay tuned for that next time.
Definitely one of our favorite topics.
Yep. And in the meantime, if you want to peek into more about what we talked about today and alluded to in our last point around the MarTech org structures, we invite you to apply to be part of that next council meeting. It's happening on July 30th. And like I said, we're doing a MarTech org structure show and tell. So there's still time to participate, but you got to apply. And that means you're not a vendor. You don't work for an agency. You work for a big global organization. When you're thinking about the big picture about how all this affects your stack and your org structure, feel free to go to realstorygroup.com and apply, and we'll have a conversation about making that happen. With that, I want to thank all our loyal listeners for tuning in again today, and invite you to subscribe. Tell your friends. Tell us your experiences of what you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis and what lessons you might want to add to this list. Until next time, Tony, we'll sign off for now. Thank you.
So long, Jarrod.